The chandeliers of Havisham House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light catching and scattering through crystal drops like captured stars, casting dancing shadows across the polished parquet floor, where silk skirts swirled in patterns as intricate as the music that filled the air with longing. The scent of hothouse roses mingled with expensive perfumes and the warm, living smell of bodies in motion, while the string quartet played a waltz that seemed to promise everything the evening itself would deny. Lady Celeste Ashford stood at the periphery of this glittering assembly, her gloved hands clasped before her pale blue gown, a color her mother had insisted would complement her complexion, though Celeste suspected it only emphasized her plainness, and watched as Lord Edmund Fairchild guided Miss Arabella Winters through the intricate steps of the dance, with a smile that only hours ago she had foolishly imagined might someday be directed at her with genuine affection. This was her 3rd season, a fact that hung about her neck like a stone, growing heavier with each passing ball. Each polite refusal, each pitying glance from matrons who had long since given up, including her name in their matchmaking calculations. 23 years old, neither beautiful nor accomplished in the ways that mattered to society, possessed of an unfortunate tendency to speak her mind on subjects no gentleman wished to hear discussed by a lady: Greek philosophy, the inaccuracies in popular histories, the fundamental illogic of certain social conventions. She had become a cautionary tale, the girl whose prospects had dimmed with each unsuccessful season until they gutted out entirely. Lord Edmund had been the 12th this season alone, and the 12th gentleman to pay initial court with seeming interest, only to withdraw with barely concealed relief once he discovered that beneath her quiet exterior lay not the biddable emptiness he sought, but rather a mind that refused to remain decoratively silent. She had known the rejection was coming even before he'd called at Ashford House that afternoon, had seen it in the slight cooling of his manner when she'd corrected his attribution of a quote to Aristotle that had actually originated with Plato, had watched his eyes glaze over when she'd attempted to discuss the philosophical implications of the Reform Act. "Lady Celeste," he had said, standing in her mother's drawing room with his hat already in hand as though he could not depart quickly enough, "I find that upon reflection, our temperaments are perhaps not as compatible as I had initially hoped," which was simply a polite way of saying that he found her tedious, too serious, too much. Now she watched him laugh at something Miss Winters said, watched the girl tilt her head in that practiced way that suggested fascination with whatever banality had just emerged from his lips, and Celeste felt the familiar weight of her own inadequacy settle more firmly upon her shoulders. Her mother stood across the ballroom in a cluster of other matrons, her face tight with a desperation that Celeste could read even at this distance, her youngest sisters still in the schoolroom, and their futures dependent upon Celeste, making an advantageous match that would restore the family's declining fortune and secure their own prospects. The air had grown stifling, thick with the mingled scents and the weight of expectations she could not meet, and Celeste turned away from the glittering assembly, moving toward the terrace doors with the careful invisibility she had perfected over 3 seasons of being overlooked, slipping through the heavy curtains into the cool mercy of the night air beyond. The terrace stretched before her like a strip of borrowed peace, the cool night air washing over her heated skin as she moved away from the French doors and their spill of golden light, her slippers soundless against the stone flagging. And it was only when she reached the balustrade overlooking the darkened gardens that she realized she was not alone. A figure stood in the shadows at the far end of the terrace, the orange glow of a cheroot briefly illuminating sharp features before fading back into darkness. And Celeste's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of Sebastian Thorne, the Duke of Ravenmore, a man whose very name was spoken in whispers, edged with fear and fascination. The Devil Duke, society called him, though never to his face, this man of 32, who had withdrawn from polite company 7 years ago, following some scandal, the details of which were never spoken plainly, but only hinted at in the kind of coded language ladies used when discussing matters, too delicate for direct address. He was known for his vast wealth, his cold demeanor that could freeze a room with a single glance, his refusal of all social invitations, his mysterious past that hung about him like a dark cloak, and the terrifying intensity of his presence that made even the bravest matrons hesitate before approaching. Celeste had seen him only once before, at a distance during her first season, and had marked him as someone to avoid, one more danger in a world already full of pitfalls for a girl like her. She turned to retreat back into the ballroom, but his voice stopped her, deep and edged with something that might have been amusement. "Fleeing already? The evening has barely begun." She turned back, her spine straightening with the automatic defensiveness that had become her constant companion, and found him watching her with dark eyes that gleamed in the shadows. "I required air, Your Grace." The ballroom was rather stifling. He took another draw on the cheroot, the ember flaring briefly, and she saw his mouth curve in something that was not quite a smile. A diplomatic answer. "What is the truth, I wonder? Did some gentleman prove insufficiently appreciative of your charms?" The question should have been impertinent, but something in his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery, and Celeste found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her. "My 12th rejection of the season, actually. Lord Edmund Fairchild. He withdrew his suit this afternoon." She expected pity, or perhaps the kind of false sympathy she had learned to recognize, but instead, the Duke gave a short bark of laughter that he quickly suppressed, though his eyes continued to gleam with what she now recognized as dark humor. 12? In a single season? That must be something of a record, lady." He paused, waiting. "Ashford, Lady Celeste Ashford." She lifted her chin, refusing to show shame. "And yes, I believe it may well be unprecedented." "The marriage market?" he said, his voice laden with cynicism as he moved closer, stepping into the light spilling from the ballroom so she could see his face properly for the first time, handsome in a harsh, angular way, with high cheekbones and a mouth made for cruelty, or perhaps for passion, she could not say which. Society's grandest spectacle, where men and women parade themselves like livestock at Tattersall's, hoping for the best price. His words echoed her own unspoken thoughts, so precisely that she felt a strange kinship with this man she did not know, this devil in gentleman's clothing. "You disapprove, Your Grace?" "I find it tedious beyond measure," he replied, flicking ash from the cheroot over the balustrade. "The endless pretense, the carefully orchestrated encounters, the lies wrapped in pretty words and prettier gowns. At least you have the distinction of honesty in your failures." She should have been offended, but instead found herself almost smiling. "You are refreshingly direct, Your Grace. Most people prefer to pretend I am simply unlucky rather than fundamentally unsuitable." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, his dark eyes searching her face as though looking for something he had not expected to find. And in that moment she saw not cruelty but rather a weariness so profound it called to the loneliness in her own soul, the recognition of another person who stood forever outside the glittering assembly, watching but never truly belonging. The moment stretched between them on the terrace, waited with understanding, before Celeste recognized that she had lingered too long in conversation with a man unchaperoned, and she murmured her excuses and returned to the ballroom where her mother descended upon her with the desperation of a woman watching her final hopes dissolve like sugar in rain. Lady Ashford's fingers dug into Celeste's arm as she steered her toward a cluster of gentlemen near the refreshment table. Her voice pitched low and urgent as she hissed instructions about smiling more, about not mentioning books or philosophy, about simpering if necessary because 3 seasons was quite enough, and the family's situation grew more precarious with each passing month. The Ashford fortune, once respectable if not grand, had been steadily declining since Celeste's father had made a series of unfortunate investments, and now the weight of expectation sat squarely on Celeste's shoulders. Marry well, marry wealthy, save her 3 younger sisters from the same fate of standing at the periphery of ballrooms, watching opportunities waltz past with other women. Her mother introduced her to Lord Hartwell, a widower of 45 with 3 children and a tendency to stand too close, whose interest in Celeste lasted precisely as long as it took for her to mention that she had been reading Plato's Republic and found his conception of justice fascinating, at which point his eyes glazed over and he excused himself to find more punch. Then came Mr. Carstairs, a younger son with modest prospects, who had seemed genuinely engaged in conversation until Celeste corrected his assertion that the Battle of Hastings occurred in 1067 rather than 1066, after which he developed a sudden need to greet an acquaintance across the room. The pattern was so familiar now that Celeste could predict each withdrawal before it occurred, could see the exact moment when interest transformed into polite distance, could feel the weight of her own unsuitability, settling more heavily upon her with each failed interaction. She thought of the previous season, of Lord Pemberton's nephew, who had called regularly for 3 weeks before discovering that she preferred discussing the philosophical implications of natural rights to gossip about mutual acquaintances, of Sir Gregory Wainwright, who had fled after she'd expressed opinions about women's education that he'd found shockingly radical, of the Italian Comte, who had initially been charmed by her until he realized her knowledge of classical philosophy surpassed his own, and his pride could not bear the comparison. The same pattern had repeated 12 times this season alone, each rejection a small cut that individually meant little, but collectively had bled her confidence dry, until she stood here watching her mother's increasingly frantic attempts to secure introductions, with men who wanted decorative wives, who would not challenge them, would not correct them, would not think too deeply or speak too honestly. The evening wore on with excruciating slowness, the music that had seemed promising at the start, now sounding discordant to her ears. And when at last the Ashford carriage arrived and they departed into the cool night air, her mother wept silently in the corner, while her father stared out the window with the expression of a man contemplating the ruin of everything he had hoped to build. And neither spoke because what was there to say that had not already been said 100 times before? Celeste pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the darkened streets of London roll past, confronting the reality she had been avoiding for months. She would become a spinster, and that pitied creature who haunted the edges of family gatherings, who was useful for minding children and organizing charitable activities, but who would never know the companionship of marriage or the blessing of her own household. And while part of her rebelled against this fate, another part wondered if perhaps solitude was preferable to marriage with a man who could never appreciate the depths of who she truly was beneath the disappointingly plain exterior. Society saw when it bothered to look at her at all. 3 days later, Celeste sat in the Ashford library with morning light streaming through tall windows and falling across the worn carpet in golden bars, her refuge from the disappointed glances of her parents and the pitying looks of servants who had witnessed the aftermath of yet another failed season. And she had finally allowed herself to contemplate what she had been avoiding. That spinsterhood was not merely a possibility, but an inevitability. That she would spend her life in this house, or perhaps in the household of a married sister, where she would be useful but never essential. That the dreams she had harbored of companionship and a household of her own must be carefully folded away like gowns that no longer fit and stored in the dark corners of her heart, where hope went to die. She had just opened Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, seeking the consolation of philosophy that had never failed her before, when Peters the butler entered with a silver salver bearing a single letter, the heavy cream paper sealed with crimson wax, stamped with an unfamiliar crest that she did not immediately recognize. And when she broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her breath caught in her throat as she read the elegant copperplate script, inviting Lady Celeste Ashford to take tea with the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmore on Thursday next at 3:00, if such an appointment would be convenient. The confusion that flooded through her was so complete that she read the letter 3 times to ensure she had not misunderstood, because she had never met the Dowager Duchess, had no connection to the Ravenmore family, beyond that single brief conversation with the Duke himself 3 nights ago on a darkened terrace, and she could conceive of no reason why this formidable woman would extend such an invitation unless it was some elaborate joke or mistake. She pulled the bell rope to summon her mother, who arrived breathless and anxious, and when Celeste showed her the letter, Lady Ashford's eyes widened with an expression of hope so desperate it was painful to witness, her mother immediately beginning to plan what Celeste should wear and how she should conduct herself, and what this unprecedented attention might mean for the family's prospects. Celeste spent the intervening days researching what she could discover about the Dowager Duchess, learning that she was 82 years old, that she had withdrawn from society 6 years ago after some unspecified dispute with her grandson, that she was known for her sharp intelligence and sharper tongue, that she had been a great beauty in her youth and had made a brilliant match with the previous Duke, and that those who had known her spoke of her with a mixture of respect and trepidation that suggested she was not a woman to be trifled with or underestimated. When Thursday arrived, Celeste dressed in her most appropriate day dress of dove-grey silk with minimal ornamentation, her hair arranged simply because she had learned long ago that attempting elaborate coiffures only emphasized the plainness of her features. And she descended to the waiting carriage with her mother's fervent instructions, ringing in her ears about making a good impression and not mentioning anything too scholarly or controversial. The journey across London seemed interminable, her nerves increasing with each turn of the wheels, and when at last the carriage drew up before Ravenmore House, she felt her breath catch at the sight of the imposing Gothic structure, with its dark stone facade and pointed arches and gargoyles leering down from the roofline, the house perfectly suited to a man called the Devil Duke, and she gathered her courage and stepped down from the carriage into whatever fate awaited her beyond those heavy oak doors. The interior of Ravenmore House was as imposing as its exterior, all dark paneling and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow Celeste, as a footman led her through corridors lit by flickering sconces, in the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and old money, and something indefinable that spoke of centuries of accumulated power. And when at last she was shown into a drawing-room, decorated in shades of burgundy and gold, she found the Dowager Duchess of Ravenmore seated in a high-backed chair positioned to catch the afternoon light. A woman whose diminutive stature was utterly belied by the force of her presence, whose white hair was dressed impeccably, whose black silk gown was severe and elegant, and whose dark eyes so like her grandson's fixed upon Celeste, with an intensity that made her feel as though every secret of her soul was being catalogued and assessed. The dowager gestured to a chair opposite her own, with a hand that trembled only slightly with age, and when she spoke her voice was crisp and clear, cutting through pleasantries with the precision of a surgeon's blade as she said, "You are wondering why I have summoned you here, Lady Celeste. So let us dispense with the usual social niceties and speak plainly, as I suspect you prefer honesty to the simpering nonsense that passes for conversation in most drawing-rooms." Celeste found herself nodding, her heart beating rapidly as the dowager continued. "I have observed you for 2 seasons now, and I have watched 12 fools reject a woman of substance because they were too shallow to recognize intelligence as a virtue rather than a flaw, and I have concluded that you are precisely the sort of person my grandson needs, which is why I am proposing that you marry him." The words struck Celeste with the force of a physical blow, a shock, rendering her temporarily speechless as the dowager poured tea with steady hands and continued as though she had merely commented on the weather. "Sebastian has refused to marry for 7 years, not since the scandal with Lady Imogen Hartley, whom he loved with the fervent devotion of youth and whose betrayal transformed him into the man society now calls the Devil Duke, and he has convinced himself that he is beyond redemption, that isolation is preferable to vulnerability. But I am 82 years old, and I will not leave this world until I have seen him settled with a woman who can appreciate the man he truly is beneath the armor he has constructed." Celeste finally found her voice, stammering that surely there must be some mistake, that she was the least suitable candidate imaginable, that she had been rejected by 12 men this season alone, and what could she possibly offer a duke? And the dowager's laugh was sharp as cut glass as she replied, "My dear child, it is precisely your so-called ordinariness that makes you extraordinary. You have not been corrupted by beauty's vanity if you have not learned to manipulate through charm. You possess genuine intelligence and authentic character, and most importantly, you will not be dazzled by his title or his wealth, but will see the lonely, wounded man who tends orchids in a conservatory because plants cannot betray him as people have done." The revelation that the dowager knew about her grandson's botanical pursuits, about the conversation Celeste and Sebastian had shared on the terrace 3 nights prior, suggested a level of observation and manipulation that was simultaneously impressive and terrifying, and Celeste felt the weight of expectation settling upon her shoulders as the dowager explained that she had been watching Celeste specifically since her first season, had noted her kindness to wallflowers, her patience with bores, her refusal to gossip cruelly about others, her quiet dignity in the face of repeated rejection, and had concluded that here was a woman of character who could be trusted with her grandson's damaged heart. When Celeste protested that the Duke had given no indication of wishing to marry anyone, least of all herself, the dowager smiled with a satisfaction that suggested she knew far more than she was revealing, and said simply, "Sebastian does not yet know what he wants, but I do, and I am asking you to consider this proposal seriously, to think about whether a marriage to my grandson, difficult and contrary as he may be, might offer you something more than the empty flattery of men who cannot appreciate your worth." Celeste sat in stunned silence, the tea growing cold in her cup, as she tried to process the extraordinary nature of this conversation, the audacity of the dowager's scheme, the terrifying possibility being laid before her like a path through dark woods that might lead either to salvation or destruction. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper as she requested time to consider. To which the dowager nodded with approval and said that wisdom required contemplation, and that Celeste was welcome to walk in the gardens while she thought, and that whatever she decided, she should know that the offer was made in absolute sincerity and with the deepest respect for her character. Celeste stepped from the drawing room into the Ravenmoor gardens, with her thoughts in such tumult that she scarcely noticed the beauty surrounding her, the carefully tended parterres and gravelled walks, the roses climbing ancient stone walls, the sound of water trickling from a moss-covered fountain, and she found herself wandering without direction as she attempted to impose order upon the chaos of her emotions, weighing the practical advantages of such a match against the terror of binding herself to a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. A man who was called the Devil Duke and who had isolated himself from society for 7 years, and yet she could not forget the weariness she had glimpsed in his eyes on that darkened terrace, the suggestion of pain carefully hidden beneath layers of cold courtesy. She had nearly convinced herself that the entire proposal was madness, that she should politely decline and return to her inevitable spinsterhood with dignity intact, when she rounded a hedge of lavender and found herself facing a vast glass structure that could only be the conservatory, its panes catching the afternoon sun and reflecting it in brilliant fragments. And even as she stood arrested by its beauty, the door opened and Sebastian Thorne emerged, and her breath caught, because he was utterly transformed from the immaculate gentleman she had met before. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with soil. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, his dark hair was disheveled as though he had run his fingers through it repeatedly, and he carried a terracotta pot containing some exotic specimen she could not identify. His expression, one of complete absorption, until he looked up and saw her standing there. The surprise that crossed his features was quickly replaced by something harder, a defensive wariness that made her heart ache with recognition, because she understood that impulse to protect oneself from further wounds. And when he spoke, his voice was cool as he said, "Lady Celeste, I was not aware we had a visitor, though I suspect my grandmother has been meddling again in affairs that do not concern her." She found herself responding with honesty that surprised them both, telling him that yes, the dowager had extended an invitation for tea, and no, she would not reveal what had been discussed because it was a private matter, and she had merely requested permission to walk in the gardens while she considered certain things, and his dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as he said, "My grandmother has peculiar notions about what might constitute my happiness, notions I have repeatedly attempted to disabuse her of without success." Celeste moved closer to examine the plant he held, recognizing it as some variety of orchid, though unlike any she had seen in England, and she asked what species it was, a question that clearly startled him because his expression shifted from wariness to something approaching interest. As he explained, it was Cattleya labiata from Brazil, notoriously difficult to cultivate in England's climate, requiring specific temperature and humidity conditions, and she listened with genuine fascination, asking informed questions about its care that revealed her own botanical reading, and for several minutes they spoke of nothing but plants, the conversation flowing with an ease that felt almost miraculous after the stilted exchanges she typically endured in drawing rooms. He invited her into the conservatory without seeming to realize he had done so, and she followed him into warmth and humidity and the overwhelming scent of growing things, surrounded by specimens from every corner of the world. And when their hands accidentally brushed as she leaned forward to examine a particularly striking bloom, she felt a jolt of awareness that shocked her with its intensity, a connection she had never experienced with any of the 12 men who had courted and rejected her, and she saw in his eyes that he had felt it too, before he stepped back abruptly and said, in a voice gone cold again, "You should know that I will never marry, Lady Celeste, that whatever schemes my grandmother has concocted are doomed to failure, that I am not a suitable husband for anyone, and have no intention of becoming one." She met his gaze steadily and replied with quiet conviction, "I understand, Your Grace, and I want you to know that marriage is not always the answer, that sometimes the courage to remain alone is greater than the courage to bind oneself to another." And the look of startled respect that crossed his features told her that she had said something he had not expected, something that had penetrated the armor he wore, and in that moment she knew that whatever she decided about the Dowager's extraordinary proposal, this man was worth knowing, worth understanding, worth the risk of caring about. Despite every lesson, rejection had taught her about protecting her heart. 2 weeks passed, and in that time something unexpected bloomed between the walls of Ashford House and Ravenmoor Estate, carried not through visits or social calls, but through the far more intimate medium of written correspondence, initiated when a package arrived for Celeste 3 days after her visit to the conservatory, wrapped in plain brown paper and containing a leather-bound volume titled Medicinal Properties of Tropical Flora, with a simple note in bold masculine handwriting that read, "You expressed interest in the healing applications of exotic specimens. I thought this might prove informative. S.T." Celeste had held that note for longer than was entirely rational, tracing the decisive strokes of his pen, imagining him at his desk, composing those few brief lines, and she had written a thank you in return, intending to keep her response brief and appropriate, but somehow her pen had taken flight, and she found herself writing not merely gratitude, but her thoughts on a particular passage regarding the use of willow bark derivatives. And when his response arrived 2 days later, it was not a polite acknowledgement, but a detailed expansion of her observations, complete with references to his own experiments, cultivating medicinal plants in the conservatory's controlled environment, and thus began an exchange that grew richer and more revealing with each successive letter. She found herself watching for the post with an anticipation that would have mortified her had anyone observed it, her heart lifting foolishly when she recognized the heavy cream stationery and the bold hand that had become as familiar to her as her own, and the letters themselves evolved from discussions of botany to philosophy to literature, Sebastian revealing a mind of remarkable depth and surprising melancholy, quoting Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, confessing to long nights reading by candlelight in the conservatory when sleep proved elusive, admitting to a loneliness he had convinced himself was preference, but which his words betrayed as exile. Celeste responded with equal honesty, sharing her own solitary habits, her love of Greek philosophy which had so appalled her suitors, her conviction that an examined life was worth the social costs, and in those written exchanges she felt a freedom she had never experienced in drawing rooms, where every word was weighed for its marriageability, where intelligence must be concealed lest it frighten away potential matches. She wrote to Sebastian of her thoughts on Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, and he responded with a passionate disagreement that nevertheless acknowledged the validity of her reasoning, and they debated the nature of virtue and the possibility of happiness for those who existed outside society's narrow definitions of propriety, their letters growing longer and arriving more frequently, until Celeste found herself writing to him nearly every day, small smiles playing across her features as she composed responses to his observations, and in the privacy of his study, Sebastian experienced the same phenomenon, finding himself thinking of her reactions as he read, composing passages in his mind before ever setting pen to paper, feeling something he had thought long dead stirring to reluctant life within his carefully guarded heart. The Dowager observed these developments with satisfaction, saying nothing but ensuring the letters passed between households with admirable efficiency, and she noted the way her grandson's expression had softened slightly, the way he spent less time hiding in the conservatory and more time at his writing desk, the way he had begun to take care with his appearance again after years of regarding such things as pointless vanity. On a grey morning in late May, when spring rain drummed against the windows of Ashford House, Celeste received a letter different from the others, longer and more formal in its opening, and her breath caught as she read Sebastian's invitation for her to visit the conservatory at her convenience, to see certain specimens that had reached their blooming period, and which he thought might interest her, given their recent correspondence about the intersection of beauty and utility in nature. And though the invitation was couched in terms of botanical education, she understood with a clarity that made her hands tremble slightly that something had shifted between them, and that they had moved beyond mere correspondence into territory both thrilling and terrifying. and she penned her acceptance with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, agreeing to visit the following Tuesday afternoon, her heart racing at the prospect of seeing him again after 2 weeks of knowing him only through words on paper, wondering if the connection they had forged in writing would survive the test of physical presence, or if it would prove to be merely the illusion of lonely people seeking solace in ink and imagination. Tuesday afternoon arrived wrapped in the golden warmth of late May sunshine, and Celeste found herself standing before the conservatory at Ravenmore House, with her heart beating an erratic rhythm against her ribs, wondering if the connection forged through written words would survive translation into the physical realm, or if they would find themselves strangers after all. But when Sebastian emerged to greet her, she saw in his eyes the same mixture of anticipation and uncertainty she felt, and something in her chest loosened at this evidence that she was not alone in her nervousness. He guided her through the conservatory's entrance into a world that took her breath away with its overwhelming beauty and strangeness. A cathedral of glass filled with specimens from every corner of the globe, their leaves creating patterns of light and shadow as sunlight filtered through the panes above, the air thick with humidity and the perfume of exotic blooms. And she stood arrested by wonder, as Sebastian explained, in a voice that gradually shed its initial formality, that he had spent 7 years developing this collection, traveling through correspondence with botanists in India and Brazil and the Far East, cultivating species that had never before survived in England's climate, creating through careful manipulation of temperature and moisture a series of microclimates that allowed such diversity to flourish. She listened with genuine fascination as he showed her orchids from the cloud forests of Colombia, their petals marked with patterns that seemed almost deliberately designed to mimic insects, and carnivorous plants from Borneo that captured prey with mechanisms of astonishing complexity, and night-blooming cereus from the Caribbean, whose flowers would open only in darkness and wither by dawn. And in his explanations, she heard not merely botanical knowledge, but passion kept alive through years of isolation, the vulnerability of a man sharing what he loved most with someone he hoped might understand. Celeste asked questions that revealed her own study, drawing connections between the specimens and the texts they had discussed in their letters, and she saw pleasure flash across his features. Each time her observations demonstrated genuine comprehension rather than polite pretense, and they moved deeper into the conservatory's green heart, so absorbed in conversation that they forgot the careful distance they had maintained, until they stood before a particularly striking specimen of Cattleya labiata, the Brazilian orchid from their first encounter, and Sebastian reached to adjust its position to better catch the light, while Celeste leaned forward to examine the intricate structure of its bloom, and their hands brushed with an electric awareness that jolted through her entire body, a connection so intense it seemed impossible that something so slight as the touching of hands could produce such profound effect. She saw in his eyes that he had felt it too, this crackling current of possibility, but instead of drawing closer, he stepped back abruptly, his expression closing like a door slamming shut, and he said in a voice gone cold and careful that she must understand he was not a suitable husband for anyone, that his reputation was deserved, that 7 years of isolation had not been mere preference, but necessary exile from a society that rightly judged him unworthy of their daughters and sisters, and she should not mistake his enjoyment of their correspondence for anything more than the selfishness of a lonely man, taking comfort where he could find it. Celeste met his gaze steadily, her heart aching at the pain he tried so hard to conceal, and she said quietly that she had learned through bitter experience not to trust society's judgments, that 12 men had found her unworthy of their regard, and yet she knew her own value remained unchanged by their blindness, and perhaps his situation was not so different from her own, 2 people rejected by a world too shallow to recognize what it was refusing, and she watched something shift behind his dark eyes, a crack appearing in the armor he wore, and in that moment, suspended in the warm green silence of the conservatory, with exotic blooms surrounding them like witnesses, they looked at each other with new understanding, seeing not the devil duke and the failed debutante, but 2 souls who had survived rejection and found in each other something society could neither provide nor comprehend. As spring deepened into early summer, a pattern established itself that felt to Celeste both dangerous and inevitable, a rhythm that carried her to Ravenmore House twice weekly, under the respectable pretext of studying the conservatory's specimens, though both she and Sebastian understood that the exotic plants were merely the acceptable excuse for something far more profound, and their conversations evolved from careful discussions of botanical matters into exchanges of startling intimacy, moments when the careful walls they had each constructed around their wounded hearts showed cracks that widened with each meeting. On a grey afternoon in early June, when rain drummed steadily against the conservatory's glass panels and mist obscured the gardens beyond, they sat together on the wrought-iron bench near the orchid collection, surrounded by the humid warmth and the scent of growing things. And Sebastian spoke with halting reluctance of the woman he had been engaged to 7 years prior, Lady Imogen Hartley, whom he had met during his first season after inheriting the dukedom, and whom he had truly loved with all the passionate idealism of a young man who still believed the world operated according to principles of honor and justice. Celeste listened without interruption as he described Imogen's beauty and vivacity, the way she had seemed to return his affection with equal fervor, the plans they had made for their future together, and then the devastating discovery, 1 week before their wedding, when Imogen had been found in a compromising position with Lord Rothschild in the Pemberton House library during a ball, the scandal that had erupted like wildfire through the ton, threatening to destroy her utterly, and Sebastian's agonizing choice to claim publicly that he had released her from their engagement due to his own unworthiness, allowing society to believe the fault lay with him rather than with her, sacrificing his reputation to preserve what remained of hers. His voice remained steady as he recounted these events, but Celeste saw the old pain etched in the lines around his mouth, the bitterness that had settled into his soul like sediment, and he explained that his decision to shoulder the blame had resulted in his ostracism from polite society. Whispers that he was unstable or cruel or harboring dark secrets, assumptions that a duke who would break an engagement so close to the wedding must be fundamentally flawed, and rather than fight these rumors, he had retreated to Ravenmore House and built walls not merely of stone, but of deliberate isolation, convincing himself that solitude was preference rather than punishment, that he had no need of a world that operated on such shallow principles. The rain intensified against the glass, creating a cocoon of sound that made their conversation feel even more private, and Celeste reached out to place her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them, a gesture of comfort that felt both completely natural and utterly unprecedented, and she told him quietly that such nobility of character deserved better than 7 years of self-imposed exile, that he had punished himself far longer than any supposed crime warranted. But Sebastian shook his head with a bitter smile and said that she did not understand how society operated, how once judgment had been passed there could be no redemption, how he had become the devil duke in their eyes and would remain so regardless of the truth. And besides, he added with a bleakness that made her heart ache, perhaps isolation was what he deserved for being fool enough to trust in love in the first place. Celeste felt the weight of his words settle over the conservatory like the heavy moisture in the air, and she knew with sudden clarity that this moment required absolute honesty, that anything less would be a betrayal of the fragile trust they had built through their letters and conversations. And so she tightened her fingers over his hand and said with quiet intensity that he was wrong to believe he deserved punishment, that the nobility he had shown in protecting Lady Imogen's reputation was not a crime requiring penance, but an act of extraordinary character. And yes, society had judged him harshly, but society's judgment was proving itself spectacularly unreliable, given that it had rejected her 12 times this season alone for the unforgivable sin of being intelligent and honest. She saw resistance flicker across his features, the instinctive denial of someone who had lived too long with self-recrimination to easily release it. But she pressed forward, leaning slightly closer as the rain continued its steady percussion against the glass above them, and she told him that nobility of character sometimes required not the performance of great sacrifices, but the simple acceptance of forgiveness, the harder task of allowing oneself to be released from the prison of past mistakes. And she could see in his eyes that her words were striking against walls he had spent 7 years constructing. Sebastian opened his mouth to argue, to retreat behind the familiar armor of cynicism, but Celeste found herself speaking before he could form the words, and what emerged was not the comfort she had intended to offer him, but rather the raw confession of her own pain, the accumulated weight of 12 rejections that had left her feeling fundamentally flawed, as though something essential was wrong with her at a level so deep that no amount of effort could correct it. And she heard her voice waver as she described the slow erosion of self-worth that came with repeated dismissal, the way each suitor's withdrawal had felt like confirmation that she was indeed too plain, too serious, too strange to deserve love, until she had nearly convinced herself that spinsterhood was not merely her likely fate, but perhaps what she actually merited. The words hung in the humid air between them, more vulnerable than anything she had intended to reveal. And she saw Sebastian's expression transform with fierce denial, all trace of his own self-pity vanishing as he turned to face her fully, his hand capturing hers with sudden intensity, and he said with a vehemence that startled her that she must never believe such poisonous nonsense, that those 12 fools who had rejected her were precisely that fools, blind and shallow creatures who could not recognize value when it was offered to them, and their rejection reflected not her unworthiness, but rather their own fundamental inadequacy as judges of character. His dark eyes blazed with an emotion she had never seen there before, something protective and almost angry, and he continued in a voice rough with feeling that society's judgment meant nothing, that a world which prized empty flattery over genuine intelligence and vapid compliance over honest discourse deserved no credence in matters of the heart, and if she believed herself unworthy, then what hope was there for any of them? Because if someone of her integrity and depth could be deemed insufficient by such shallow standards, then the entire system revealed itself as corrupt beyond redemption. Celeste stared at him, her breath catching at the passion in his defense of her, and she saw in that moment the first true crack in his emotional armor, the place where his protective walls had given way to reveal the man beneath, and something shifted between them in that rain-shrouded conservatory, a recognition that they had both been wounded by the same cruel world, and that perhaps their wounds might heal more easily if tended together. But before either could speak further, they heard footsteps approaching and voices echoing through the glass structure, and Sebastian released her hand with visible reluctance as Morrison appeared to announce the arrival of Lord and Lady Pemberton, bringing with them news of the upcoming midsummer ball and expectations that could no longer be avoided. The drawing room at Ashford House felt smaller than usual 3 days after the interrupted conversation at Ravenmoor, as though the walls had contracted with the weight of Lady Ashford's increasing desperation, and Celeste sat with rigid posture on the settee while her mother paced before the windows overlooking the street, wringing her hands in a gesture that had become habitual during these final weeks of the season, and the air carried the scent of her mother's lavender water, mixed with the faint staleness of rooms that had seen too many anxious consultations and not enough joy. Lady Ashford's voice trembled as she outlined what she termed their final opportunity, explaining that the midsummer ball at Pemberton House would mark the season's conclusion, that families would depart for their country estates immediately thereafter, and that if Celeste had not secured an offer by then, all hope for her younger sister's prospects would dim considerably, given that the Ashford family's dwindling fortune could not support 3 unmarried daughters indefinitely, and Celeste felt the familiar guilt settle over her like a heavy cloak as she watched her mother's distress and knew herself to be the cause of it. The situation grew more unbearable when Lady Ashford revealed with barely suppressed hysteria that she had learned all 12 gentlemen who had rejected Celeste during this season would be in attendance at the midsummer ball, and she had formulated what she called a strategic plan to approach each one again with renewed overtures, suggesting that perhaps circumstances had changed or that previous misunderstandings might be clarified, and Celeste listened with growing horror to her mother's elaborate schemes involving careful positioning in the ballroom and orchestrated encounters, understanding that her mother's love manifested as this desperate manipulation, but finding it no less mortifying for that understanding. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain that no amount of strategic positioning would change the fundamental fact that those 12 men had found her wanting and would not reconsider, but the words died in her throat when she saw the hope flickering in her mother's eyes, that terrible, fragile hope that refused to accept defeat. And so she merely nodded with what she hoped resembled agreement, while dread pooled cold and heavy in her stomach at the prospect of facing all 12 rejectors in one glittering assembly, of enduring their pity, or worse, their sudden mercenary interest, if rumors of her connection to the Duke of Ravenmore had spread through society's inexorable gossip networks. Meanwhile, across London in the Gothic splendor of Ravenmore House, Sebastian stood in his grandmother's sitting room, holding a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Pemberton crest, his jaw tight with barely controlled frustration as the Dowager watched him with eyes that missed nothing, and the invitation to the midsummer ball felt heavy in his hand, despite being merely paper and ink, carrying as it did the weight of 7 years' absence from society and all the complicated emotions that accompanied a return to the world that had judged him so harshly. His grandmother's voice held a note of steel beneath its superficial sweetness as she informed him that she had personally arranged for the invitation to be extended, that she had made certain assurances to Lady Pemberton regarding his attendance, and most significantly, that she had indicated his intention to escort Lady Celeste Ashford to the ball, presenting this information as established fact rather than suggestion. And Sebastian felt the familiar anger at her manipulation war with something more troubling, a reluctance to disappoint Celeste that he could not entirely explain even to himself. He wanted to refuse, to toss the invitation into the fire burning in the grate, and retreat once more to the safety of his conservatory, where the rules were clear and the judgments came only from himself. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Celeste's face as she had defended him against his own self-recrimination, heard her voice saying that nobility of character required acceptance of forgiveness, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that refusing this invitation would be a form of cowardice, a retreat into the isolation he had claimed to choose, but which felt increasingly like a prison, and so he found himself agreeing with a curt nod that sent satisfaction flickering across his grandmother's features, even as his own heart hammered with something that felt disturbingly like fear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the entrance hall of Ashford House when Morrison announced the Duke of Ravenmore's arrival, and the effect of those words upon the assembled family was immediate and electric. Lady Ashford's teacup, clattering against its saucer as she rose with such haste that her skirts nearly upset the side table, Mr. Ashford's newspaper rustling to the floor forgotten, and Celeste's younger sisters clustering at the drawing-room doorway with wide eyes and barely suppressed gasps, because the Devil Duke himself stood in their modest entrance hall, removing his gloves with casual elegance, while Morrison took his hat and walking stick with the careful deference one reserved for visiting royalty. Sebastian cut an imposing figure in the afternoon light, his dark coat impeccably tailored across broad shoulders, his cravat tied with austere precision that somehow made the fashionable excesses of other gentlemen seem ridiculous by comparison. And when his eyes found Celeste's across the suddenly crowded space, she saw beneath his customary reserve something that looked almost like apology, as though he regretted the disruption his presence caused, even as he moved forward to execute the formal courtesies with her parents. Lady Ashford recovered her composure with visible effort, her voice trembling only slightly as she welcomed the Duke and invited him to join them for tea, though Celeste could see her mother's hands shaking as she rang for fresh service, and she understood that her mother was calculating the social significance of this unprecedented visit, adding and re-adding the potential advantages in her mind like a merchant totaling accounts. The formal pleasantries proceeded with excruciating slowness, Sebastian responding to Mr. Ashford's cautious questions about his estates with polite brevity, while Celeste sat rigid on the settee, acutely aware of her sister's stares and her mother's barely contained hope, until finally Sebastian set down his teacup with deliberate precision and announced that he had come to request the honor of escorting Lady Celeste to the midsummer ball at Pemberton House, and the subsequent silence held such profound shock that Celeste heard the clock on the mantel ticking and the distant sound of a carter's wagon passing in the street beyond. Lady Ashford's expression transformed through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, joy, calculation, triumph, before settling into gracious acceptance as she granted permission with the air of bestowing a great favor, though everyone in the room understood that no mother would refuse such a request from a Duke of Sebastian's wealth and standing, regardless of his reputation. And Mr. Ashford added his gruff approval, while Celeste's sisters dissolved into excited whispers that they attempted and failed to suppress. The formalities concluded, Lady Ashford suggested with transparent intent that perhaps the Duke and Celeste might wish to take a turn about the garden, and Sebastian rose with alacrity that suggested he had been hoping for precisely such an escape, extending his arm to Celeste with a slight inclination of his head that conveyed both invitation and plea. The garden at Ashford House could not compare to the splendor of Ravenmoor's grounds, being merely a small walled space with a few rose bushes and a gravel path, but it offered blessed privacy from the watching eyes of Celeste's family, and the moment the door closed behind them, she turned to Sebastian and said quietly that he need not feel obligated to follow through with this, that she understood his grandmother had manipulated the situation, and she would not hold him to an arrangement made under duress, watching his face as she spoke and seeing something shift in his dark eyes. Sebastian was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the modest roses climbing the garden wall, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an honesty that made her breath catch, because he said that yes, his grandmother had maneuvered them both into this position with her customary ruthlessness, but he found to his surprise that he did not wish to be released from the obligation, that the prospect of attending the midsummer ball held considerably less terror when he imagined facing it with Celeste at his side. And more than that here, his eyes returned to hers with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her chest. He wished specifically to attend with her, not as duty but as choice. They discussed what this public appearance would mean, standing close together on the gravel path while afternoon sun slanted through the leaves overhead, and Sebastian outlined with his characteristic bluntness the likely consequences of her association with him, the whispers and speculation, the way society would judge her for accepting the escort of the Devil Duke. But Celeste responded with equal honesty that society had already judged her and found her wanting 12 times over, that she had little reputation left to protect, and besides, she had learned through their conversations that his own assessment of his character mattered more to her than the collective opinion of people who valued appearances above substance. Sebastian's expression softened at her words, something vulnerable flickering across features usually held in rigid control, and he reached for her hand where it rested on his arm, covering it with his own in a gesture that felt both protective and grateful, and they stood thus for several heartbeats while the moment stretched between them, carrying the weight of unspoken possibilities, until the sound of the drawing-room window opening reminded them that they remained under observation, and propriety required they maintain appropriate distance. They agreed then to face the midsummer ball together, two outcasts entering the glittering heart of society that had rejected them both, and as they walked back toward the house, Celeste felt something shift inside her, a straightening of her spine and lifting of her chin, because she would not attend as a desperate supplicant, hoping for acceptance, but rather as the companion of a man whose respect she had earned through authenticity rather than artifice, and that knowledge carried its own quiet power. The remainder of Sebastian's visit passed in a blur of her mother's excited planning and her sister's admiring questions, but when he finally took his leave and Morrison showed him out, Celeste caught his glance back toward her from the doorway, saw in it both promise and apprehension, and she understood that they were both stepping into unknown territory where the old rules no longer applied and new ones had yet to be written. And as the door closed behind him, she heard her mother already calling for the dressmaker, because apparently Celeste's existing ball gowns would not suffice for such an occasion, and the house erupted into the frantic preparations that would consume the following days until the night of the midsummer ball arrived with all its attendant hopes and terrors. The night of the midsummer ball arrived wrapped in the heavy warmth of late June, and Pemberton House blazed with such extravagant illumination that it seemed to challenge the stars themselves, thousands of candles burning in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across marble floors, polished to mirror brightness, while the cream of London society gathered in silks and jewels that represented fortunes spent to impress one another during this final glittering spectacle before the season's end and the retreat to country estates. Sebastian arrived at Ashford House precisely at the appointed hour, and when Morrison opened the door, Celeste stood at the top of the stairs feeling her breath catch at the sight of him, because the Duke of Ravenmoor in full evening dress possessed a severe elegance that made other men's fashionable excesses seem foolish by comparison. His black coat fitted with austere perfection across broad shoulders, and his cravat tied with mathematical precision, his dark eyes finding hers with an intensity that made the modest entrance hall feel suddenly intimate despite her family's presence in the drawing-room doorway. Her own gown was the product of her mother's frantic consultations with the dressmaker, a creation in deep sapphire silk that Lady Ashford had declared would complement Celeste's coloring, and though Celeste had felt self-conscious during the fittings, she saw something shift in Sebastian's expression as she descended the stairs that gave her courage, a softening around his mouth, and a warmth in his gaze that spoke more eloquently than words. The carriage ride to Pemberton House passed in charged silence, Sebastian seated across from her in the confined space, while London's streets rolled past the windows, and Celeste found herself acutely aware of every small detail, the way his hands rested on his knees with controlled stillness, the line of his jaw illuminated by passing street lamps, and the tension in his shoulders that betrayed his apprehension about returning to society after 7 years of self-imposed exile. And she wanted to reach across the space between them to offer comfort, but propriety and uncertainty held in her still. Their arrival at Pemberton House created the sensation Sebastian had predicted, because the moment they stepped through the ballroom entrance and were announced by the major domo, conversation ceased with such abruptness that the orchestra's strings seemed suddenly too loud, and Celeste felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward them like a physical pressure against her skin, whispers erupting in their wake like wind through dried leaves, and she understood that they had become, in that instant, the evening's primary spectacle, the failed debutante and the Devil Duke making their scandalous appearance together. She saw them all in that frozen moment of entrance, the 12 men who had rejected her this season scattered throughout the glittering assembly. Lord Edmund Fairchild, near the refreshment tables with his mouth slightly agape, Lord Hertford, by the windows looking startled, young Mr. Pemberton actually taking a step backward as though their presence might contaminate him, and the humiliation she might have felt at facing them all together transmuted into something else entirely when Sebastian's hand found her elbow, and with gentle pressure, positioning himself slightly forward in a gesture that was unmistakably protective, his dark eyes sweeping the ballroom with cold assessment that dared anyone to offer insult. The crowds parted before them as they moved deeper into the ballroom, not with welcoming warmth but with the deliberate separation one might give something dangerous or contagious, and Lady Pemberton's greeting, when they reached their hostess, carried such barely concealed disdain beneath its superficial courtesy that Celeste felt Sebastian's arm tense beneath her hand, though his expression remained impassive as he responded with impeccable manners that somehow made Lady Pemberton's rudeness more obvious by contrast, and Celeste realized that they would spend this entire evening isolated within the crowded ballroom, two outcasts, whose presence together had violated some unspoken rule about acceptable scandal, and she lifted her chin and met the staring eyes around them with what she hoped resembled composure, even as her heart hammered against her ribs, and she wondered whether courage or foolishness had brought them to this glittering battlefield, where society's judgment would be rendered in whispers and turned backs and carefully calculated snubs. They navigated the evening's treacherous social waters like two sailors guiding a vessel through hostile seas, isolated within the crowded ballroom by invisible walls of judgment and speculation, and Celeste found unexpected comfort in their shared exile, because Sebastian's dry observations about the hypocrisy surrounding them, delivered in undertones, meant only for her ears transformed what might have been unbearable into something almost bearable. His commentary on Lady Pemberton's excessive jewelry that she whispered looked like she had robbed a dragon's hoard, making Celeste suppress laughter behind her fan, and she caught herself smiling despite the stares and whispers, feeling something shift between them as they stood together against society's collective disapproval. The orchestra had just concluded a country dance when Celeste noticed a ripple of renewed interest moving through the assembly, heads turning toward the entrance where a woman stood framed in the doorway, and she felt Sebastian's entire body tense beside her before she understood who had arrived, because Lady Imogen Rothschild swept into the ballroom with the confidence of one who had survived scandal and emerged triumphant, her emerald gown a declaration of prosperity, her beauty undimmed by the 7 years since her own public disgrace, and Celeste watched as recognition and something darker flickered across Sebastian's features before his expression settled into cold impassivity that she had learned to recognize as his armor against pain. Lady Imogen moved through the crowds with deliberate progress toward where they stood, and Celeste felt Sebastian's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on her elbow, saw the muscle working in his jaw, and when Imogen finally reached them and extended her hand with a smile, that held complicated layers of meaning. Sebastian's bow over her gloved fingers carried such frigid courtesy that frost might have formed in the air between them. His Lady Rothschild, a masterpiece of polite contempt that made Imogen's smile falter for just an instant, before she recovered and expressed pleasure at seeing him return to society after so long an absence. The exchange was brief but charged with histories that Celeste could only partially understand. Imogen's eyes flicking between Sebastian and Celeste, with calculation visible beneath social pleasantries, her questions about how they came to be acquainted together, carrying undertones that suggested she found their pairing curious if not incomprehensible, and Celeste felt protective fury rising in her chest at the subtle condescension in Imogen's tone, at the way this woman who had shattered Sebastian's trust now studied them both as though they were specimens of interest, and she found herself stepping slightly closer to Sebastian's side in a gesture of solidarity that was not lost on Imogen's observant gaze. When Imogen finally moved away to join her husband near the card-room, Sebastian exhaled slowly, and Celeste saw beneath his controlled facade the cost of that encounter, the old wound reopened by proximity to the woman who had betrayed him, and she wanted to offer comfort, but before she could speak, the orchestra began, the opening strains of the first waltz, and the ballroom's atmosphere shifted again as gentlemen moved toward ladies they wished to partner, and Celeste braced herself for the awkwardness of standing unchosen while couples formed around them. But instead she found herself suddenly surrounded by approaching figures, and to her shock, she recognized Lord Hertford and Mr. Pemberton, and even Lord Edmund Fairchild, moving toward her with expressions of intent that made her stomach clench with confused apprehension. They converged upon her with transparent purpose. These men who weeks earlier had rejected her suit or shown no interest whatsoever, and now suddenly they competed for her attention with declarations of admiration that rang hollow as cracked bells. Lord Hertford, mentioning that he had always appreciated her scholarly nature, Mr. Pemberton claiming he had been meaning to call upon her family, and Edmund Fairchild stepping forward with presumptuous familiarity to suggest that surely she would grant him this dance given their long acquaintance, and Celeste understood with sickening clarity that her association with the wealthy Duke of Ravenmore had transformed her in their mercenary eyes from unmarriageable bluestocking into desirable connection, that they saw her now only as potential pathway to Sebastian's influence and fortune, and the humiliation of this realization burned through her chest, because even now, even standing beside a man who had shown her genuine respect, society's judgment reduced her to an object of calculation rather than a person of worth, and she felt Sebastian's fury radiating beside her like heat from banked coals as he observed the transparent opportunism of these assembled hypocrites who now clustered around the woman they had previously dismissed without a second thought. Lord Edmund Fairchild stepped forward with the presumptuous confidence of a man who believed his own revised history, his voice pitched deliberately loud enough to carry across the immediate vicinity, as he declared that he had long held Lady Celeste in the highest regard and would be honored if she would grant him the pleasure of this waltz, the transparent falsehood of his claim making Celeste's breath catch in her throat, because this was the same man who 3 weeks earlier had informed her father that while he found her conversation stimulating, he could not, in good conscience, offer for a woman whose interests were so unfashionably intellectual, and now he stood before her weaving fiction about long-standing admiration, while his eyes calculated the advantage of connection to the Duke of Ravenmore's considerable fortune and influence. Before Celeste could summon words to refuse him, Lord Hertford inserted himself into the growing spectacle with his own declaration of having always appreciated her scholarly nature, conveniently omitting that he had withdrawn his suit after one stilted conversation in which she had corrected his misattribution of a Plutarch quotation. And then Mr. Pemberton joined the chorus, claiming he had been meaning to call upon the Ashford family, each successive falsehood layering upon the last until Celeste felt suffocated by the weight of their transparent opportunism, and she saw in their eager faces not genuine regard, but mercenary calculation, saw herself reduced once again to an object of utility rather than a person of worth, except now her value derived entirely from her proximity to Sebastian, rather than any inherent quality she possessed. The other rejected suitors pressed closer, creating a small crowd around her that drew the attention of nearby guests who turned to observe this unexpected display, and Celeste felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest, because even in this moment, when she stood beside a man who had shown her genuine respect, society's judgment still found ways to diminish her, still rendered her invisible, except as a potential pathway to masculine power and wealth, and she opened her mouth to deliver the cutting refusal these hypocrites deserved, when she felt Sebastian move beside her with such controlled fury that the air itself seemed to chill around them. His voice, when he spoke, carried the cold precision of a blade drawn from its sheath, cutting through the assembled suitors' declarations with devastating clarity as he addressed Lord Edmund directly, observing in tones of deadly courtesy that it was remarkable how rapidly a man's long-standing regard could develop in the space of 3 weeks. Since Sebastian had it on excellent authority that Fairchild had rejected Lady Celeste's suit less than a month prior, with particular emphasis on her unsuitability as a wife, and the shocked silence that followed this observation rippled outward through the ballroom like ice forming across still water. Edmund's face flushed dark red as surrounding guests absorbed Sebastian's implication, and he began some stammering protest about misunderstanding. But Sebastian continued with relentless precision, his dark eyes moving across each of the assembled opportunists as he catalogued their hypocrisies with surgical exactness, noting how convenient it was that Lord Hertford had overcome his aversion to intelligent women, how fortuitous that Mr. Pemberton had remembered his intention to call just as Lady Celeste appeared in the Devil Duke's company, how transparent their mercenary calculations appeared to anyone with eyes to see, and Celeste watched as these men who had rejected her withered beneath Sebastian's contempt, while the watching crowds absorbed every word with avid attention that would fuel gossip for weeks to come. The ballroom had fallen into that peculiar stillness that precedes either violence or revelation. The orchestra's instruments silent, hundreds of eyes fixed upon the unfolding confrontation, and Celeste saw in the frozen faces around her shock and calculation, and in some cases barely concealed delight at this spectacular breach of propriety, but she found she could not summon concern for social consequences because Sebastian's defense of her worth had cracked something open in her chest, some long-defended fortress of resignation, and when he turned from the assembled hypocrites to face her directly, his expression transforming from cold fury to something infinitely more tender, she felt the entire glittering ballroom recede until only the two of them existed in this charged moment of suspended possibility. And she understood before he spoke that everything was about to change irrevocably, that they stood together at the precipice of choice that would define both their futures. And she lifted her chin and met his gaze with acceptance of whatever came next, with trust in this man who had seen her clearly when society rendered her invisible. And she waited for Sebastian to speak the words that would claim her publicly before these assembled witnesses and transform her from society's reject into the Devil Duke's chosen bride. Sebastian turned from the assembled hypocrites to face Celeste directly, and the transformation in his expression from cold fury to something infinitely more tender made her breath catch in her throat and made the entire glittering ballroom with its hundreds of watching eyes recede until only the two of them existed in this charged moment of suspended possibility. And when he extended his hand toward her, it was not the casual gesture of a gentleman requesting a dance, but something far more significant, something that carried the weight of choice and consequence and irrevocable change, and his voice when he spoke rang clear across the ballroom's shocked silence, pitched deliberately for all to hear, as he addressed her with words that would echo through society's gossip for months to come. "Lady Celeste," he said, and there was no coldness in his tone now, no trace of the Devil Duke's legendary frost, only warmth and certainty, and something that sounded remarkably like reverence. "I find your intelligence quite the most remarkable quality I have encountered in 3 decades of existence. Your honesty refreshing beyond measure in a world that traffics primarily in pleasant falsehoods, and your character admirable in ways that shame the shallow judgments of lesser minds." And Celeste felt tears prickling behind her eyes as he continued, as he enumerated her worth before these assembled witnesses who had deemed her unmarriageable, as he transformed every quality that society had judged as flaw into virtue, through the simple act of seeing her clearly and speaking that truth aloud. "Any man who failed to recognize your worth," Sebastian declared with devastating precision that made several of her rejected suitors flinch visibly, "is a fool of the highest order, blind to what stands before him, and I count myself fortunate, beyond deserving, that their collective blindness has left you unattached and free to consider my own suit, for I would be honored beyond expression if you would grant me this waltz." And the shocked gasps that rippled through the ballroom were nearly drowned by the pounding of Celeste's heart as she understood what he was offering her, not merely a dance, but a public declaration of intent that would bind them together in society's eyes and transform her from failed debutante into the chosen bride of the Duke of Ravenmore. She stood at the precipice of choice, aware that she could refuse this spectacular gesture, could protect herself from the scandal of association with the Devil Duke, or could retreat into the safer obscurity of spinsterhood rather than stepping into the glare of public scrutiny that acceptance would bring. But as she met Sebastian's dark eyes and saw in them genuine regard rather than mercenary calculation, saw the vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior, and saw the man who had defended her worth when she had struggled to defend it herself. Celeste knew her answer with the same certainty that she knew the sun would rise tomorrow, and she placed her gloved hand in his with a small smile that held no hesitation whatsoever. Her quiet, "I would be honored, Your Grace," carrying across the silent ballroom like a bell announcing transformation. The orchestra seemed to understand the significance of the moment, for the opening strains of the waltz began immediately, and as Sebastian led her onto the floor, Celeste was aware that they would dance alone, that no other couple would dare join them in this charged space, and that every eye in the ballroom would fix upon them with avid attention that would fuel gossip and speculation and judgment for weeks to come. But when Sebastian's hand settled at her waist and her palm met his, when they began to move together in the waltz's elegant patterns, she found she could not summon concern for society's opinions, because the intimacy of their proximity overwhelmed all other awareness, and she looked up into his face and saw reflected in his expression the same wonder and certainty that filled her own chest, and they danced together through the glittering ballroom as though they moved through a world containing only the two of them. Sebastian's whispered, "Forgive me for creating such spectacle." I could not bear their presumption another moment, met with Celeste's equally quiet. "There is nothing to forgive. I have never been more grateful for anything in my life." And as the waltz carried them in graceful circles beneath the chandelier's cascading light, Celeste understood that this dance marked the death of one life and the birth of another, that she would never again be the rejected debutante standing at the periphery of society's glittering assemblies, but neither would she be diminished into merely the Devil Duke's bride, for Sebastian had claimed her not as possession but as equal, had elevated her worth in the very act of choosing her, and she felt something settle into place in her chest, some long-defended fortress finally surrendering to the siege of genuine regard, and she smiled up at him with uncomplicated joy as they waltzed together before the shocked assembly and dared anyone watching to question the rightness of their union. The waltz continued its elegant patterns as Sebastian and Celeste moved together through the glittering ballroom, and the intimacy of their proximity made conversation feel both necessary and impossible because there was so much to say. Yet the simple fact of dancing together seemed to communicate truths that words could only diminish, but Sebastian's voice when he finally spoke was low enough that only she could hear, pitched for her ears alone as he said, "I must confess something to you, Celeste, something I have been attempting to deny for weeks now, but can no longer ignore in good conscience." And she felt her heart accelerate as she met his dark eyes and waited for him to continue, watching the vulnerability that crossed his features as he gathered courage to speak words that clearly cost him dearly. "I have come to care for you beyond friendship," he admitted, his hand tightening slightly at her waist as they turned through the waltz's graceful movements. "Beyond the intellectual companionship I told myself was sufficient, beyond the pleasant correspondence I convinced myself required no deeper examination, and my grandmother's scheming proved far wiser than I knew, because she saw what I was too blind and too frightened to acknowledge, that you are precisely the woman I need, the only woman I have ever truly needed, and I have been a coward for not recognizing this sooner." And Celeste felt tears prickling behind her eyes at his confession, because she had not dared to hope that her own growing feelings might be reciprocated, and assumed that his regard remained purely intellectual, despite the evidence of moments when their gazes held too long, or their hands touched with electric awareness. "I too have been denying what I felt," she whispered back, her voice trembling slightly with the enormity of this admission. telling myself that friendship with you was gift enough, that I should not presume to hope for more from a man like you. But Sebastian, these weeks of letters and conversations and stolen hours in your conservatory have transformed me in ways I am only beginning to understand, for you have shown me that my worth is not determined by society's shallow judgments, that intelligence and honesty and authenticity have value beyond the marriage market's calculations, and in teaching me to see my own worth clearly, you have also taught me to recognize genuine regard when it is offered. And she saw in his expression such relief and wonder that she knew her words had reached him and had broken through whatever remained of the walls he had built around his wounded heart. They danced on as Sebastian spoke of transformation, of how their connection had taught him to trust again after 7 years of bitter isolation, how her patient acceptance of his damaged past had shown him that forgiveness was possible, that he need not punish himself eternally for the sins of youth and the cruelties of circumstance. And Celeste responded with her own acknowledgement of transformation and of learning her own worth through his clear-eyed regard, of understanding that the 12 rejections that had seemed like failures were actually protections, guiding her toward this exact moment with this exact man. And as the music swelled toward its conclusion, she felt the rightness of their union settle into her bones with the certainty of mathematical proof. The final notes of the waltz hung in the air as they came to rest in the center of the ballroom floor, still holding each other, still aware only of each other despite the hundreds of watching eyes, and Sebastian's voice when he spoke next was clear and formal and loud enough to carry across the shocked silence, as he said, "Lady Celeste Ashford, will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife, not for reasons of practicality or convenience, but because I love you with my entire heart, and cannot imagine facing another day without you beside me?" And Celeste's joyful, "Yes, Sebastian, yes, with all my heart," was barely spoken before his mouth claimed hers in a kiss that was scandalous and defiant and absolutely perfect. A kiss that declared to all assembled witnesses that they belonged to each other regardless of society's approval or disapproval, and when they finally broke apart, to the sound of scattered applause mixed with shocked gasps of disapproval, neither cared in the slightest what judgment the glittering assembly might render, because they had found in each other something infinitely more valuable than social acceptance, and they stood together facing the future, with hands clasped and hearts aligned, and the certain knowledge that their love would prove stronger than any force that might seek to diminish it. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the ancient chapel at Ravenmoor, a ceremony far more intimate than the grand society spectacles that typically marked ducal marriages, for Sebastian and Celeste had agreed without discussion that they wanted only those who truly mattered to witness their union, and so the small stone chapel with its jewel-toned windows and worn flagstones held perhaps 40 guests rather than hundreds, and the atmosphere was one of genuine joy rather than obligatory attendance, and Celeste felt as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm that every step carried her toward the life she was meant to inhabit, rather than away from some lesser existence she should mourn. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew, with a satisfied smile playing about her lips, looking somehow both triumphant and peaceful as she watched her beloved grandson turn to face his bride with an expression of such open tenderness that several guests dabbed at their eyes, and Celeste's mother wept happily throughout the ceremony, while her younger sisters whispered excitedly about how romantic it all was, and even her father's usual stern countenance softened as he placed Celeste's hand in Sebastian's and murmured a quiet blessing that made his new son-in-law's eyes brighten with unexpected emotion. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity, the ancient words of the marriage service gaining weight and meaning as Sebastian and Celeste spoke their vows with voices steady and certain, promising to love and honor each other through whatever might come, and when the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, and Sebastian kissed her with reverent care, Celeste felt something settle into place in her chest, some final piece of her heart clicking into alignment as she understood that she was precisely where she belonged, married to precisely the man she was meant to love. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in Ravenmoor's grand dining room, transformed by the Dowager's expert direction into a space that felt warm and welcoming despite its Gothic grandeur, and the meal was filled with laughter and genuine conversation rather than the stiff formality that typically characterized such occasions. and it was during the toasts that Sebastian presented Celeste with his wedding gift, leading her by the hand to a room she had never before entered, to reveal a private library he had spent weeks preparing, filled with rare philosophical texts and first editions and scholarly works she had mentioned in passing during their conversations, each volume carefully selected to match her interests and arranged on shelves of polished mahogany, with a reading chair positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light. Celeste's eyes filled with tears at the thoughtfulness of this gift, at the evidence of how carefully he had listened to her casual remarks and remembered her expressed interests, and her own gift to him suddenly felt inadequate until she saw his face when she presented it, a detailed botanical illustration she had labored over for days, depicting his favorite orchid in full bloom, rendered with such precision and care that he studied it in wondering silence before pulling her into his arms and whispering that it was the most meaningful gift he had ever received, because it proved she had truly seen him, had understood what mattered most to his heart. They departed for their honeymoon that same evening, amid showers of rice and cheerful farewells, bound for Italy on what Sebastian described as a botanical expedition. But what both understood was really an escape into private happiness, and the weeks that followed were filled with explorations of ancient gardens and Renaissance conservatories, with mornings spent sketching rare specimens and afternoons lost in intimate conversation, and with evenings of growing physical passion as they learned each other's bodies with the same patient attention they had devoted to learning each other's minds and hearts. The transition to married life upon their return to Ravenmoor proved seamless, as though they had always belonged together in these Gothic halls, and their days settled into patterns of shared contentment that included mornings working together in the conservatory, where Sebastian tended his plants while Celeste made notes for a treatise she was developing on medicinal applications of exotic flora, and evenings reading together in the library he had created for her, sometimes debating philosophical points with the same spirited engagement that had characterized their earliest letters, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence with their books and the knowledge of each other's presence, and nights of deepening intimacy and tenderness as their love continued to grow and transform. And Celeste discovered that the passion she had read about in poems and novels paled beside the reality of being loved completely by a man who saw her clearly and valued what he saw, and she understood with quiet certainty that every rejection she had endured, every humiliation and disappointment, had been necessary to bring her to this exact life with this exact man, and she would not change a single painful moment if the price of erasure was never knowing the profound happiness that filled her days now. 2 years later, the transformation of Ravenmoor House was complete in ways that extended far beyond mere physical renovation, for the Gothic halls that had once echoed with silence and isolation now rang regularly, with voices engaged in passionate, intellectual discourse, as Sebastian and Celeste had established a tradition of hosting monthly gatherings for scholars, botanists, philosophers, and natural historians who came from across England and the continent to share research and engage in debates that stretched late into the evening, and the drawing rooms that had witnessed decades of formal stiffness now accommodated lively conversations about botanical classification systems and the philosophical implications of recent scientific discoveries, and the conservatory had become something of a pilgrimage site for serious students of exotic flora who marveled at specimens they had only read about in texts and who benefited from Sebastian's generous willingness to share both cuttings and knowledge. Celeste had published her treatise on medicinal applications of rare plants the previous autumn, a work that bore both her name and Sebastian's as collaborators, and which had been received with surprising enthusiasm by the academic community, earning praise from physicians and botanists alike for its rigorous methodology and practical applications, and she was currently at work on a second volume that would explore the intersection of ancient philosophical texts and botanical knowledge, examining how Greek and Roman writers had understood the properties of plants in ways that modern science was only beginning to validate, and her correspondence with scholars throughout Europe had grown so extensive that Sebastian had laughingly suggested they needed to employ a secretary solely to manage her letters. Their reputation in society had shifted gradually but unmistakably over these 2 years, evolving from scandal to grudging acceptance to something approaching respect. For while they would never be conventional by the ton standards, their obvious intellectual achievements and the caliber of guests they attracted to Ravenmoor had forced even the most hidebound members of society to acknowledge that the Devil Duke and his peculiar Duchess had created something of value, though there remained those who whispered about impropriety and unwomanly pursuits and the unseemliness of a duchess engaging in scholarly publication, whispers that neither Sebastian nor Celeste troubled themselves to address because they had learned that living well according to their own values constituted the only response worth making. On this particular September afternoon, Celeste stood in the conservatory with their infant daughter Eleanor, cradled in her arms, the child named for the dowager, who had passed peacefully in her sleep 6 months prior, with a satisfied smile on her lips, as though she had completed some great work and could now rest, and the baby reached out with pudgy fingers toward a magnificent white orchid bloom that swayed gently in the warm air, her dark eyes wide with wonder at the exotic beauty before her, and Sebastian moved to stand beside his wife and daughter, placing his hand gently on the small of Celeste's back, as he had done 1,000 times in their marriage, and the gesture as natural as breathing and as meaningful as any declaration of love. "She has your curiosity," Celeste murmured, smiling as Eleanor made cooing sounds and stretched determinedly toward the flower. "Already fascinated by growing things and beautiful specimens, and I suspect we shall find her conducting botanical experiments before she can properly walk." And Sebastian laughed softly as he guided their daughter's hand to gently touch the orchid's petal, teaching her even at this tender age to appreciate beauty with reverence rather than grasping possessiveness. And he said, "Then she shall be properly educated in matters of real importance rather than the frivolous accomplishments society deems essential for young ladies, and perhaps by the time she comes of age, the world will have progressed sufficiently that intelligent women need not disguise their minds to attract suitable husbands." And Celeste leaned into his embrace as she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of profound contentment. She thought of the girl she had been 2 years ago, standing on the periphery of a ballroom, counting rejections and believing herself fundamentally flawed, never imagining that those very rejections were protecting her from marriages that would have slowly extinguished everything essential about her nature. And she understood now, with the clarity that only hindsight provides, that society's judgment had been the greatest blessing of her life, because it had left her available when Sebastian entered her world, had kept her unencumbered by obligations to men who could never have valued what made her extraordinary, and every humiliation she had endured in those desperate seasons had been necessary preparation for recognizing genuine love when it appeared wearing the unlikely guise of the Devil Duke, and she would not trade a single painful moment if the price was never knowing this happiness, never standing in this conservatory with this man and this child, and this life they had built together against all conventional wisdom and social expectation. That evening found them once more in the conservatory as twilight painted the glass panes in shades of amber and rose, their daughter Eleanor sleeping peacefully in the nursery under her devoted nurse's watchful care, and Sebastian and Celeste stood together among the orchids and exotic specimens that had witnessed so many of the crucial moments in their courtship, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they watched the last light fade from the sky and the first stars emerge in the deepening darkness. "Do you remember that first night on the terrace?" Celeste murmured, leaning back against his chest with the comfortable ease of long intimacy. "When I told you about my 12th rejection and you laughed, and I thought you were the most frightening man I had ever encountered." And Sebastian's quiet chuckle rumbled through his chest as he pressed a kiss to her temple and replied, "I remember thinking you were the first, honest person I had met in 7 years, the first woman who did not simper or flatter or pretend to be something she was not, though I would not admit even to myself how desperately I needed that honesty, how starved I had been for genuine connection." And they stood in companionable silence for a moment, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that encounter to this life they had built together, against all expectations and social conventions. Sebastian tightened his arms around his wife and said softly, "My grandmother knew, somehow she understood before either of us did, that we were meant to save each other, that your rejection by society was not punishment, but protection, keeping you available for something far better than any of those 12 fools could have offered." And Celeste turned in his embrace to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek with tender fingers as she replied, "She saw what we could not yet see in ourselves, that my supposed flaws were actually the qualities you needed most, and that your isolation had preserved you for a woman who would value your depths rather than fear them, and I think she must have died very satisfied, knowing she had accomplished what she set out to do. And they shared a smile of mingled grief and gratitude for the formidable woman who had orchestrated their happiness with such determined wisdom. Dear listener, perhaps you have faced rejection yourself. Perhaps you have stood on the periphery of some metaphorical ballroom, counting the ways in which you have been found wanting by those whose judgment seemed to matter. Perhaps you have believed the lie that rejection reflects your fundamental unworthiness rather than simply the blindness of those who could not see your value. And if so, let this story offer you a different perspective, a gentle reminder that sometimes what feels like failure is actually providence, protecting you from paths that would diminish rather than fulfill you, that the right person will not require you to hide your intelligence or dampen your passion or apologize for the very qualities that make you extraordinary, that patience and authenticity will ultimately lead you to connections far deeper and more meaningful than any gained through pretense or compromise. Your worth is not determined by those who fail to recognize it. Your value is not diminished by others' inability to perceive it, and the rejection that wounds you today may prove to be the greatest blessing of your life, when you look back from the vantage point of genuine happiness and realize that every closed door was necessary to keep you walking toward the one thing that would open onto your true home. Trust in the timing of your life. Have courage to wait for what is truly meant for you, rather than settling for what is merely available. And know that somewhere in this vast world there exists someone who will treasure precisely those qualities that others have foolishly overlooked. Someone who will claim you not despite your uniqueness but because of it. Someone who will stand with you in metaphorical conservatories at twilight and thank Providence for the rejections that left you both available to find each other. May you find peace in patience. May you discover strength in authenticity. May you recognize your inherent worth regardless of others' judgments. And may you eventually stand in your own version of happiness, wrapped in the arms of someone who sees you clearly and loves what they see. Understanding at last that every painful moment of waiting was preparation for this joy. Until we meet again in another story, rest well in the knowledge that your perfect match is also searching, also waiting, also trusting that the right connection will come at precisely the right time. This has been a Lullaby Library Tale, and if this story brought you comfort or hope, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with someone who needs to hear that rejection is not the end of their story, but often the beginning of something far more beautiful than they dared imagine.